The first thing you need to understand is that forests don't keep secrets because they're hiding something. They keep secrets because people eventually stop asking the right questions. I learned that lesson from a cardboard archive box no larger than a microwave. It sat on the highest shelf of a forgotten records room, coated in so much dust that someone had written a smiley face into it years earlier. The label had faded until only 3 words remained visible beneath cracked tape. Lost Field Logs, Colorado. I almost put it back. Not because I was afraid. Because I thought it would be boring. At the time, I worked as an environmental records specialist for a nonprofit research institute that partnered with state and federal land managers across the American West. My job wasn't glamorous. I reviewed decades-old field journals, wildlife surveys, erosion reports, trail maps, and weather observations before they were digitized for historical preservation. Most boxes contained exactly what you'd expect: faded handwriting, coffee stains, and endless notes about elk migration or soil composition. The forgotten box looked no different. It should have been another ordinary Tuesday. Instead, it became the beginning of a story I still haven't figured out how to explain, not because I think something supernatural happened, but because I no longer trust the simple explanations I once depended on. Some nights, I wake convinced I imagined everything. Other nights, I remember details I wish I'd forgotten. And every time someone asks why I left field research for good, I tell them the same lie. I got tired of working in remote places. The truth is much harder to say aloud. There are places where maps end long before the forest does. There are trails that disappear without ever being officially closed. And somewhere in the Colorado wilderness, there's a valley whose existence survives only inside the pages of journals no one was ever supposed to lose. Or perhaps no one was supposed to find again. That archive box changed the direction of my life before I even cut through the brittle packing tape. Inside were 12 leather-bound field notebooks, each wrapped in wax paper that had yellowed with age. A folded topographic map rested beneath them, marked with dozens of pencil circles that had blurred from moisture decades ago. Most of the journals belonged to different wilderness observers and ecological surveyors between the late 1970s and early 1990s. Every notebook carried the same regional assignment somewhere along Colorado's central mountain wilderness, high elevations where spruce and fir forests swallowed old mining roads and snow often lingered into early summer. At first glance, everything appeared routine. Daily temperatures, bird counts, water quality measurements, vegetation changes, routine maintenance observations. Nothing remarkable. Then I noticed something impossible. Every journal ended abruptly. Not gradually. Not naturally. Abruptly. Entire seasons would be documented in meticulous detail before the writing simply stopped. Sometimes halfway through a sentence. Sometimes after a single unfinished word. One notebook ended with, "He came back this morning, but he still thinks." Nothing after that. The remaining pages were blank. Another ended after listing weather conditions. Temperature. Wind direction. Cloud cover. Then one final sentence. "The trees are facing the wrong way today." Blank pages followed. No explanation. No continuation. No closing report. Just silence. At first, I assumed missing pages had been removed. But they hadn't. The bindings were intact. Every blank page remained perfectly attached. It wasn't as though someone had torn the ending away. It was as though the writers had simply stopped existing in the middle of their thoughts. That realization stayed with me far longer than it should have. Still, strange documents appear in historical archives all the time. Field researchers retire unexpectedly. Journals are misplaced. Records become separated from official reports. There was probably an ordinary explanation. I believed that for almost 3 weeks. My name is Daniel Mercer. At least, that's the name I'll use. The people in this story are fictional, and so am I, in the sense that this tale is meant as horror rather than history. But if you've ever spent enough time alone in wilderness, you'll recognize the emotional truths hidden beneath fiction. I grew up outside Durango, Colorado, where mountains shaped every season of my childhood. My father taught high school biology. My mother restored historical documents at a county museum. Between them, I inherited two lifelong habits. Respect evidence. Respect nature even more. The mountains never frightened me. Not when I was a child building forts beneath ponderosa pines. Not while studying ecology in college. Not during years assisting wildlife surveys across remote public lands. To me, forests were systems. Beautiful. Complex. Predictable. Every strange sound eventually had a source. Every mystery had enough patience. That certainty became part of who I was. When I accepted the archival position in Boulder after graduate school, I assumed my days of backcountry work were mostly over. I traded muddy boots for climate-controlled storage rooms and computer databases. My office overlooked a parking lot instead of alpine ridges. Oddly enough, I missed the silence. Cities produce constant noise that the brain eventually edits away. Forests are different. They're quiet enough that every sound matters. Wind has direction. Birdsong has territory. Branches crack for reasons. You begin to recognize patterns without realizing you're learning them. Maybe that's why the journals unsettled me. Their authors noticed patterns too. Patterns they never explained. One afternoon, while cataloging the sixth notebook, I found the first repeated phrase. Not identical wording. The same idea. Different people. Different years. Different handwriting. One surveyor wrote, "Do not trust familiar landmarks after heavy fog." Another nearly a decade later. "Always verify location twice after morning mist." A third simply underlined one sentence 3 times. "Memory is less reliable here than the compass." That caught my attention. Experienced wilderness professionals rely on observation above all else. Getting disoriented can happen to anyone, especially during storms or dense fog, but the language felt unusually personal. Not, visibility decreased. Not, navigation became difficult. Instead, they questioned their own memory. I created a spreadsheet listing unusual entries. It started as professional curiosity. Then it became something closer to obsession. Repeated themes emerged across notebooks whose authors had likely never met. Fog. Silence. Missing time. Animals refusing certain valleys. Compasses behaving normally while people insisted directions had changed. No single event connected every journal. Instead, they resembled fragments of one conversation spread across 15 years. One Friday evening, after most of the staff had gone home, I unfolded the old topographic map across my desk. The penciled circles marked locations scattered throughout one wilderness region west of the Continental Divide. At least, that's what they appeared to mark. Many circles overlapped. Others surrounded blank areas where no trail existed. One location had been erased so aggressively the paper had nearly torn through. In the margin, someone had written in tiny block letters, "Review begins where certainty ends." No signature. No date. Just those 5 words. Outside my office window, rain tapped steadily against the glass. The building had grown almost silent. Air conditioning hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hallway, an old fluorescent light buzzed with uneven rhythm. It suddenly occurred to me that I'd been alone for nearly 2 hours. I checked the time. 8:47 p.m. Later than I'd realized. I packed the journals back into their box, intending to leave for the weekend. As I lifted the final notebook, something slipped from between its pages. A photograph. Black and white. Slightly curled around the edges. It showed 4 field researchers standing beside a wooden wilderness sign. All 4 smiled at the camera. Behind them stretched dense spruce forest disappearing into mountain fog. The sign should have identified the trailhead. Instead, every word had been scratched away except one. Return. Nothing else. No trail name. No mileage. Just that single word. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded blue ink, "If only 3 people come back, do not ask who is missing. Ask why everyone remembers a different 4th person." I stared at those words for a long time. Not because they frightened me immediately. Because they felt like the opening sentence of a puzzle my brain couldn't stop trying to solve. I counted the faces again. 4 people. Perfectly ordinary. 1 woman wearing a broad-brimmed field hat. 2 men in weather jackets. Another younger researcher holding a clipboard against his chest. Nothing unusual. Until I looked away. For just a second. When my eyes returned to the photograph, I hesitated. Had the man with the clipboard been standing on the left, or the right? I frowned. Looked again. It shouldn't have mattered. Yet I couldn't shake the strange certainty that I'd remembered the arrangement differently only moments before. I laughed quietly to myself. Too many hours in a dusty archive. Too much coffee. Too little sleep. There had to be a rational explanation. There always was. I slipped the photograph back into the notebook, locked the records room, and drove home through steady rain beneath the dark outline of Colorado's Front Range. The entire way home, one thought kept circling through my mind, not the photograph, not the journals, not the unfinished sentences. It was something much simpler. I couldn't remember whether the archive box had originally been labeled Lost Field Logs or Returned Field Logs. The weekend should have been enough to clear my head. Instead, it gave my imagination 2 uninterrupted days to stitch together questions that had no business fitting together. By Monday morning, I had convinced myself that everything strange about the journals could be explained by ordinary human psychology. Memory is imperfect. Patterns emerge where none exist. Once your brain notices a coincidence, it begins hunting for more until coincidence starts masquerading as meaning. I repeated that to myself during the drive to the Institute. It sounded convincing. It even sounded scientific. Then I unlocked the archive room. The cardboard box was no longer on the top shelf. It sat neatly in the middle of my desk. For a moment I assumed one of my coworkers had moved it while searching for something else. "Morning, Sarah," I called toward the neighboring office. "Did someone reorganize the Colorado records?" Her chair squeaked as she leaned around the doorway. "What Colorado records?" "The field journals." She frowned. "The old wildlife surveys?" "No. The leather notebooks." She looked genuinely confused. "I haven't been in your archive all week." Neither had anyone else. Our preservation lab required electronic sign-ins every time someone entered storage. I checked the access log. Only one badge had opened the room since Friday evening. Mine. The timestamp read Saturday. 9:13 a.m. I stared at the screen. I knew exactly where I'd been Saturday morning. Buying groceries in Boulder. I'd spent nearly an hour comparing hiking socks at an outdoor supply store because mine were finally wearing through. I still had the receipt in my wallet. There was no possible way I had driven to work. At least, I didn't remember doing it. I laughed under my breath. Software glitches happened. Badge readers failed. Someone must have entered using a maintenance override. Still, the uneasiness settled deeper than I wanted to admit. I opened the box again. This time I approached the journals differently. Instead of reading them chronologically, I organized them by location. Most entries clustered around ordinary survey zones. Creeks. Old burn scars. Abandoned logging roads. But 6 notebooks repeatedly referenced a place that didn't officially exist. Not by name. By absence. The writers described it indirectly. The basin beyond marker 12. The valley west of the unnamed ridge. The place without birds. The drainage that isn't on newer maps. Every description pointed toward the same general area while carefully avoiding identifying it. Almost as though naming it mattered. Or perhaps they couldn't agree what it was called. I spread every map across the conference table. Modern satellite imagery. Historic forestry maps. USGS topographic sheets dating back nearly 70 years. Most matched perfectly. One didn't. A government survey map printed in 1981 showed an entire side valley that vanished from every edition published afterward. Not crossed out. Not renamed. Simply absent. The contour lines had changed as though the valley itself had never existed. That wasn't impossible. Maps are updated. Errors are corrected. Old roads disappear. Streams are reclassified. But valleys don't simply stop existing. At least not on paper. I enlarged both versions on my computer. The ridgelines matched. The rivers matched. Every elevation point matched. Only that single indentation in the mountains had been erased. I called a retired cartographer who occasionally volunteered with our archive. His name was Leonard Brooks, a man who spoke about maps the way musicians spoke about symphonies. When I emailed him both images, he phoned less than 15 minutes later. "Where'd you get these?" "The archives." "You sure they're authentic?" "As far as I can tell." Silence lingered. Finally he sighed. "Topographic revisions happen. Survey errors happen. But changing terrain like that..." He hesitated. "I've only seen something similar once." "What caused it?" "I was never given an answer." "You mean nobody knew?" "I mean nobody wanted to discuss it." He chuckled afterward, trying to lighten the conversation. "Probably bureaucratic nonsense." "Probably." Yet his hesitation lingered in my mind long after the call ended. That afternoon I found another loose page hidden inside one of the journals. Unlike the others, it wasn't handwritten. It had been typed on an old mechanical typewriter. No heading. No signature. Only a list. Never travel alone after extended silence. If wildlife disappears, stop recording observations. Do not compare memories until reaching populated areas. Never assume yesterday's trail still exists today. If you discover previous versions of yourself in written notes, burn the notes. Do not continue reading. The first 4 lines sounded like overly cautious wilderness advice twisted into superstition. The 5th one stopped me cold. I flipped through every journal again, searching for context. Nothing. No explanation. No reference. No continuation. Just that single page. By now my curiosity had become personal. I wanted to know who had written it. Not because I believed any of it. Because people don't invent warnings without believing they're useful. That evening, I requested permission to review off-site storage records housed in a climate-controlled warehouse outside Golden. Thousands of retired documents rested there, untouched for decades. If matching reports existed, they'd probably be there. Permission came surprisingly quickly. 2 days later I drove west beneath an overcast sky, following highways that gradually climbed into rolling foothills where subdivisions gave way to open pine forest. The warehouse looked exactly like every government storage facility you've ever seen. Concrete. Metal siding. Rows of identical shelving stretching into dim fluorescent light. The air smelled of cardboard and old paper. A technician named Miguel led me toward a section labeled Historical Field Materials. "You researching fire history?" he asked. "Ecological surveys." He nodded. "Lot of strange stuff back here." "Strange?" He shrugged. "Old paperwork. Missing pages. Duplicate files." "Duplicate?" "You'll see." He smiled as though he made a joke only he understood. Several hours passed uneventfully. Most archived reports expanded on the journals I'd already read. Weather. Wildlife. Trail maintenance. Everything painfully ordinary. Until I reached a file cataloged under an internal reference number rather than a descriptive title. Inside lay only 3 items. A folded map. A cassette tape. A sealed envelope. The envelope bore one instruction. Archive only. Do not index. That alone violated every preservation standard we followed. Curiosity overruled procedure. I opened it. Inside rested a single sheet of paper. Typed. Undated. Whoever reviews the Colorado recovery logs must avoid reconstructing chronological order. Chronology encourages pattern recognition. Pattern recognition increases fixation. Fixation precedes false familiarity. If false familiarity develops, terminate review. There was no signature. Only a handwritten initial. I leaned back in my chair. The warehouse had become unusually quiet. Forklifts that had buzzed through distant aisles all morning seemed to have stopped. Even the ventilation system sounded quieter. It was the sort of silence you notice only because something had been making noise moments earlier. I looked around. Rows upon rows of shelves disappeared into shadow. Thousands of forgotten documents. Countless histories. No windows. No voices. Only fluorescent lights humming overhead. Then, very faintly, footsteps. Slow. Measured. Somewhere beyond the shelving. I assumed another employee was working nearby. The footsteps stopped. So did I. Several seconds passed. Nothing. I returned to reading. Another step. Closer. I looked up again. Still no one. Miguel? No answer. The footsteps resumed. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. I stood and walked to the end of the aisle. Empty. Long corridors of shelving stretched in every direction. No workers. No carts. No movement. I checked my phone. No signal. Not unusual for a steel warehouse. Still, the place suddenly felt much larger than it had an hour earlier. As I turned back toward my table, something caught my eye. One shelf away sat another archive box. Same size. Same faded tape. Same handwritten label. Lost Field Logs, Colorado. I frowned. I was already working from that box. Why would there be another? I walked over. The inventory sticker listed a different accession number. Different year. Different storage location. I opened it. Inside were 12 leather journals. Identical to mine. Same colors. Same worn bindings. Same arrangement. My pulse quickened. Duplicates happened. Institutions often stored copies. That wasn't alarming. Until I opened the first notebook. The handwriting was identical. The stains matched. The torn corner on page 14 matched. Even the pressed pine needle between 2 pages rested in exactly the same place. Not similar. Exactly the same. As though someone had photocopied an object instead of a document. Then I noticed something impossible. One sentence had changed. In the journal I'd been studying all week, an entry ended with, "The birds refused the Western Basin today." This one read, "The birds remembered leaving the Western Basin today." Just one word. Refused. Remembered. Everything else remained identical. A single altered word transformed a simple observation into something deeply unsettling. I hurried back to compare both copies side by side. But when I reached my table, the first archive box was gone. Only the second one remained. I stood there, staring at the empty tabletop, trying to reconstruct the last 5 minutes with absolute certainty. Had I carried the wrong box? Had I imagined setting the first one down? Or had I walked across that silent warehouse carrying someone else's memory instead of my own? For the first time since opening those forgotten journals, I stopped worrying about what had happened to the people who wrote them. I started worrying about what the journals were quietly beginning to do to me. I should have reported everything that afternoon. Not because I believed anything impossible had happened. Because my confidence in my own observations had begun to erode, and an environmental researcher who can no longer trust his observations has no business handling historical records. Instead, I did exactly what curiosity has convinced countless sensible people to do throughout history. I kept going. By the time I drove back toward Boulder, the late autumn sun had disappeared behind thick mountain clouds. The Front Range looked less like a landscape and more like the jagged spine of some enormous sleeping animal stretching across the horizon. Rain drifted across the highway in thin silver sheets, never becoming heavy enough to demand attention, but never stopping long enough to forget it was there. The windshield wipers moved with hypnotic rhythm. Back and forth. Back and forth. For nearly an hour I replayed every moment inside the warehouse. The second archive box. The altered sentence. The missing original. There had to be an explanation. Someone had reorganized materials. I had mixed up accession numbers. Fatigue had distorted my memory. Every answer I came up with sounded perfectly reasonable, until I examined it for more than a few seconds. Reasonable explanations usually become stronger the longer you think about them. These became weaker. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made a decision. I wasn't interested in proving anything supernatural. I wanted to prove myself wrong. The next morning I requested every available document connected to the journal's original collection. Shipping manifests, acquisition paperwork, preservation reports, donation records. Anything. The Institute's database returned only a single result. Collection source, unknown. No donor. No agency. No recovery notes. No transfer paperwork. Nothing. That wasn't merely unusual. It was nearly impossible. Historical collections don't simply appear inside climate-controlled archives. Every document has a chain of custody. Someone discovers it. Someone transports it. Someone signs for it. Bureaucracy leaves fingerprints on everything. Except this collection. It was as though the journals had arrived without ever passing through anyone's hands. Sarah wandered into my office carrying 2 coffees. "You look awful." "I've looked worse." She handed me one of the cups. "You've been talking in your sleep." I blinked. "What?" She laughed. "Yesterday. During lunch. I wasn't asleep." "You definitely were." "I was reading." She tilted her head. "You fell asleep sitting up." "No, I didn't." Her smile faded. "Dan, you answered me while your eyes were closed." A chill crawled across my shoulders. "I don't remember that." "I figured." She shrugged, trying to keep the mood light. "You kept saying something weird." "What did I say?" She thought for a moment. "Don't let them organize the days." She laughed again. "Honestly, I assumed you were dreaming about spreadsheets." I forced a smile. But my stomach had tightened into a knot. I had no memory of falling asleep. None. That afternoon I reviewed security footage from the preservation lab. Not because I expected anything dramatic. I simply wanted confirmation that Sarah had mistaken what she'd seen. The cameras showed me sitting at my desk shortly after noon. Exactly as I remembered. Then, around 12:43, I stopped writing. My pen rolled from my fingers. My head lowered slightly. I remained perfectly still for almost 4 minutes. Not slumped over. Not asleep in the ordinary sense. Just motionless. Sarah entered carrying coffee. She spoke. Video has no audio, but I watched her smile. She placed a cup beside me. Then something happened I still struggled to explain. Without lifting my head, without opening my eyes, I answered her. She nodded. We exchanged several sentences. Then she walked away. Only after she'd left did I slowly raise my head and continue writing exactly where I'd stopped. There was no visible transition. No stretching. No confusion. Nothing. If someone had edited out 4 minutes of footage, I never would have noticed. Except the timestamp never skipped. I watched it 3 more times. Every viewing unsettled me a little more. That evening I did something I hadn't done since graduate school. I took one of the journals home. Technically, that violated archive policy. Technically, I signed the checkout form. Officially, I intended to study handwriting consistency. Unofficially, I wanted to see whether the journals felt different outside the archive. It's remarkable how quickly ordinary objects change character after sunset. The notebook looked harmless beneath fluorescent office lights. In my apartment, illuminated by a single reading lamp while rain whispered against the windows, it felt older. Heavier. As though the leather had absorbed decades of cold mountain air. I turned slowly through the pages. Weather observations. Wildlife counts. Trail conditions. Routine. 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 Then, halfway through the notebook, I found a page I could have sworn wasn't there before. No page had been added. The paper matched perfectly. The handwriting matched. Yet I had absolutely no memory of reading it. The entry was dated October 14th. Visibility remained excellent today. That should have been reassuring. Instead, every landmark appeared familiar before we reached it. Harris insisted he had never walked this drainage. 20 minutes later he correctly described the bend in the creek, the fallen spruce, and the abandoned lookout foundation beyond the ridge. When asked how he knew, he became angry. He accused us of pretending to forget. I frowned. I would have remembered that entry. Wouldn't I? I turned back toward earlier pages. They seemed subtly different now. Not rewritten. Not altered. Just unfamiliar. Like rereading a childhood book you were certain contained scenes that somehow no longer existed. I blamed exhaustion. Closed the notebook. Went to bed. Sleep came quickly. Dreams did not. I dreamed I was hiking through dense Colorado timber beneath an overcast sky. The forest felt real enough that I could smell wet pine needles beneath my boots. Ahead of me walked 4 researchers wearing faded green field jackets. None spoke. None looked back. I couldn't see their faces. Only their backs disappearing between enormous spruce trunks. Every few minutes one of them would stop walking. The others continued without noticing. The person who stopped would quietly step off the trail into the trees. No hesitation. No emotion. Just leave. By the end of the dream, only one figure remained. He reached a weathered wooden sign. The same sign from the old photograph. Except this time I could read the faded lettering beneath the scratches. Return as you arrived. The man slowly turned toward me. His face was blurred. Not hidden. Blurred. As though my memory refused to finish drawing it. Then he spoke. His voice sounded almost conversational. How many of us are left? I opened my mouth. Couldn't answer. Because I suddenly realized I couldn't remember how many people had been walking at the beginning. 4? 5? 3? The number dissolved every time I reached for it. The blurred man smiled sadly. You've started counting wrong. I woke before dawn with my heart hammering. The room was silent. Except. Not entirely. Somewhere inside the apartment. Pages were turning. Very slowly. One page. Then another. I sat upright. Listened. The sound came again. Soft. Dry. Like someone reading a very old book. The journal rested exactly where I'd left it on the dining table. Closed. The pages continued turning. I told myself there had to be a draft. An open window. Air from the heating vent. I checked every window. Locked. Every vent. Barely running. Yet when I approached the notebook, the sound stopped. I stared at it for nearly a minute before opening the cover. A pine needle fell into my lap. Fresh. Bright green. Still carrying the sharp scent of living sap. I picked it up. Moisture glistened along its surface. It hadn't dried. It hadn't browned. It looked as though someone had plucked it from a tree only moments earlier. I lived on the 3rd floor. There were no pine trees anywhere near my apartment building. I wrapped the needle inside a clean evidence envelope from an old field kit and placed it in my desk drawer. For the first time since this began, I preserved something not because I understood it, but because I was afraid I might later convince myself it had never existed. The following morning I drove straight to the institute. Before unlocking my office, I stopped in the hallway. The archive door stood slightly open. I was certain I had locked it the previous evening. Very certain. Inside, the lights were already on. No one appeared to be there. The journals sat neatly stacked in the center of my desk. Beside them rested something I had never seen before. A leather-bound field notebook. Newer than the others. No catalog number. No archive label. No accession sticker. Its cover bore only one line, stamped in faded silver letters. Field Observer 13. My hands felt suddenly cold. Every previous record referred to 12 researchers. Every photograph showed 4 people. Every inventory listed 12 notebooks. There had never been a 13th. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I opened the cover. The first page contained only a single handwritten sentence. The ink looked fresh enough that it hadn't completely soaked into the paper. If you're reading this before you've entered the valley, you still have time to remember your life correctly. I should have walked away the moment I read that sentence. Closed the notebook. Locked the archive. Requested medical leave. Found a neurologist. Done anything except continue. Looking back now, I don't think curiosity was driving me anymore. Curiosity asks questions. What I felt was something quieter. Recognition. As though I'd stumbled onto the edge of a memory that refused to reveal itself until I took one more step. Then another. Then another. I sat alone in the archive room for nearly an hour before turning the page. Unlike the older journals, the paper inside Field Observer 13 was almost pristine. The leather smelled newer. The handwriting was confident, deliberate, and strangely familiar, though I couldn't explain why. The first entry wasn't dated. It began in the middle of a thought. The problem isn't that the valley changes people. The problem is that people assume memory belongs entirely to themselves. It doesn't. Places remember us, too. I frowned. It sounded less like a field report and more like philosophy. I kept reading. Every trail is an agreement. A path exists because enough minds accept the same route through the landscape. Most forests honor that agreement. One valley does not. I leaned back. The words were beautifully written. Almost poetic. Exactly the sort of language a rational researcher should dismiss. And yet, they echoed ideas buried throughout the older journals. Not copied. Completed. Like someone had gathered scattered fragments from 12 unfinished stories and quietly assembled them into one. The next page contained something unexpected. Coordinates. Not complete. Only the first half. Enough to identify a mountain range. Not enough to locate a destination. Below them someone had written, "The rest cannot be written until remembered." That sentence lingered with me long after I closed the notebook. Because it didn't ask to be believed. It simply waited. Over the following week my work began to suffer. Simple catalog entries took twice as long. I misplaced files. Forgot conversations. Several times I walked into storage rooms without remembering why I'd gone there. Sarah noticed first. "You sure you're okay?" "I've just been distracted. You've asked me my last name 3 times. I laughed awkwardly. "No, I haven't." She didn't laugh back. "Dan." Her voice softened. "You have." I wanted to argue. Instead, I realized I couldn't remember whether she was right. That terrified me far more than the journals ever had. Because memory doesn't announce when it fails. It quietly replaces certainty with confidence. You still feel sure. You just happen to be wrong. I scheduled an appointment with my physician. Blood work. Neurological screening. Vision tests. Everything came back normal. Stress, the doctor suggested. Burnout can affect concentration. He wasn't wrong. Stress can produce remarkably strange symptoms. Derealization. Memory lapses. Sleep disturbances. Even mild hallucinations. I accepted his explanation. For almost 24 hours. Then I found the photograph again. Not the copy inside the journal. Another print. Tucked inside my coat pocket. I had absolutely no memory of placing it there. This version was clearer. The scratches across the trail sign had faded. For the first time I could read the original lettering beneath them. Cedar Hollow Observation Route. The name meant nothing to me. It appeared on no map. No database. No survey index. No historical trail register. I searched every record available through the Institute. Nothing. Not one mention. It was as though the trail had never officially existed. Except, late that evening, I found one reference buried inside an old wildfire assessment from 1978. Not in the report itself. In the margin, someone had penciled 4 words. Do not reopen Cedar Hollow. No explanation. No initials. Just those words. My pulse quickened. The next morning I drove to the university library where historical aerial photographs of Colorado were stored. Rows of oversized map drawers filled the basement. A librarian helped me locate aerial surveys from the late 70s. Hour after hour I compared photographs. Logging roads, creeks, avalanche scars, mining ruins. Everything aligned. Until one image, taken during late autumn. Clouds covered most of the mountains. But one narrow valley remained unusually clear. Almost unnaturally clear. At its entrance stood a small ranger station. The building appeared abandoned. Roof partially collapsed. Beside it, 6 vehicles. I counted twice. 6. The accompanying survey notes identified only 3 authorized personnel working that district during the flight. 3 people. 6 vehicles. No explanation. I enlarged the image under magnification. The vehicles looked weathered. Different decades. One appeared brand new. Another resembled a pickup from the early 60s. One looked older still. As though several years had been parked beside each other. I laughed at myself. Perspective can be misleading. Old photographs distort details. I was reading too much into shadows. The librarian returned carrying another folder. Interesting coincidence, she said. What is? You're the 2nd researcher this month asking about this area. I looked up. The 2nd? She nodded. Older gentleman. Did he leave a name? I don't think so. What was he researching? She shrugged. He kept asking whether we stored original photographs, or remembered versions. She smiled uncertainly. I assumed he meant restored prints. When was this? About 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Exactly when I'd opened the archive box. A coincidence. It had to be. On my drive home, snow began falling across the higher elevations. By the time I reached Boulder, the mountains had disappeared behind a white curtain. Something about the storm reminded me of childhood camping trips. My father used to tell me that fresh snow erased certainty. Trails vanished. Footprints disappeared. The forest became honest again. Back then I thought he meant navigation. Now, I wasn't sure. That night I spread every map across my apartment floor. Modern editions. Historic surveys. Hand-drawn sketches copied from the journals. Using tracing paper, I layered them one above another. The missing valley slowly emerged. Not because it appeared. Because everything else seemed arranged around its absence. Roads curved strangely. Trails ended abruptly. Survey grids skipped empty space. Like water flowing around a buried stone. At nearly 2 in the morning, I finally saw it. The pencil circles from the journals weren't marking locations. They were marking viewpoints. Every observer had stood somewhere different, looking toward exactly the same place. The valley itself. No one had entered it. Not according to their maps. Not according to their written observations. Every report described watching from outside. Every report ended before crossing the same invisible line. Every one except Field Observer 13. I opened the newer notebook again. Halfway through, I found another undated entry. Observation eventually becomes participation. You think you're studying the valley. Eventually the valley begins studying you. That is when people mistake familiarity for destiny. I closed the notebook harder than I intended. Enough. I needed distance. Fresh air. Reality. The next morning I requested a week's vacation. Officially to recover from burnout. Unofficially, to prove to myself that I could ignore the journals. I packed hiking gear into my truck. Nothing unusual. Just enough supplies for a few quiet days exploring familiar public trails far away from the mystery consuming my thoughts. No old maps. No notebooks. No coordinates. I deliberately chose a completely different national forest hundreds of miles south. A place I'd visited countless times. Somewhere safe. Somewhere known. The drive lasted nearly 5 hours. The higher I climbed, the thinner the air became. Aspen leaves shimmered gold beneath dark evergreen slopes. Fresh snow dusted distant peaks. Everything looked comfortingly familiar. I reached the trailhead shortly before sunset. Only 3 vehicles occupied the parking area. A retired couple loading backpacks. A young photographer adjusting a tripod. And an aging green pickup truck coated in dried mud. Something about the truck tugged at my memory. Not because I'd seen it before. Because I thought I had. The license plate was obscured by dirt. Its windshield carried a faded wilderness permit. The date printed on the permit read, October 1986. I stopped walking. Permits aren't valid for decades. Someone must have kept it as a souvenir. Perfectly ordinary. Except, the permit wasn't faded. It looked current. As though it had been issued yesterday. The retired couple waved politely before disappearing down the trail. The photographer nodded without speaking. Within minutes, I was alone. A cold wind drifted through the pines. Somewhere high above, a raven called once. Then silence settled over the forest. Not empty silence. Listening silence. The kind every experienced wilderness traveler notices immediately. No squirrels. No insects. No distant woodpeckers. Even the wind seemed strangely careful. I checked my compass out of habit. North. Exactly where it should be. My GPS functioned normally. Trail markers matched the map. Everything was real. Everything was measurable. Everything was exactly as it should be. And yet, about half a mile ahead, standing beside the trail where no structure should have existed, I saw a weathered wooden sign. Its paint had almost completely peeled away. Only 3 words remained legible. I stood motionless for what felt like several minutes, waiting for the sign to become something ordinary. A trick of weathered paint. A misread trail marker. An old maintenance sign left behind decades earlier. Anything. When you're frightened, your mind bargains with reality. It offers increasingly unlikely explanations in exchange for preserving the comforting belief that the world still follows familiar rules. The sign never changed. Cedar Hollow, 4 miles. I unfolded my trail map. No Cedar Hollow. I checked the GPS. No junction. Only the main trail winding north through dense spruce forest. I looked back toward the parking lot. It had already disappeared behind the trees. The forest seemed impossibly still. Not dead. Waiting. I laughed once quietly. Enough. The sound vanished into the trees without an echo. I turned around. I was going home. It should have taken 15 minutes to reach the trailhead. Instead, after nearly 20 minutes of steady walking, I rounded a bend and found the same wooden sign waiting beside the trail. Cedar Hollow, 4 miles. I stopped so abruptly my backpack shifted against my shoulders. No. I looked behind me. My footprints stretched clearly through the thin layer of fresh snow. One set. Mine. No circles. No intersections. Just a straight line leading exactly where I'd come from. I followed them backward. 5 minutes later, the footprints ended. Not faded. Not covered by wind. Ended. The snow beyond them remained untouched. I knelt and pressed my gloved hand into the surface. Cold. Undisturbed. There should have been tracks leading all the way back to the parking area. Instead, it looked as though I had begun existing halfway along the trail. For several long breaths I simply stared. Then survival instinct overpowered curiosity. I switched on the emergency locator beacon clipped inside my pack. Its green light flashed once. Then twice. Then died. Fresh batteries. Installed that morning. My satellite messenger displayed only a single message before the screen went blank. Wait. Nothing else. No signal bars. No error code. Just that one word. The wind returned. Only now I noticed something strange about it. It carried no scent. Mountain forests always smell of something. Pine resin. Wet soil. Moss. Decaying leaves. Snow. This air smelled like paper. Dry. Dusty. Old. The same scent that filled the archive room. My pulse quickened. I forced myself to keep moving. The trail narrowed between enormous spruce trees whose trunks disappeared into gathering fog. Not thick fog. Thin enough to see through. Yet every distant object seemed slightly misplaced. Trees appeared farther away than they should. Rocks looked familiar before I reached them. A fallen log seemed to have been waiting exactly where I expected it. Recognition arrived before observation. I remembered the journals. Memory is less reliable here than the compass. My compass still pointed north. My certainty did not. Half an hour later I reached a clearing. At its center stood a ranger station. Exactly like the one in the old aerial photograph. Weathered timber walls. Collapsed porch. Rusted rain barrel. Broken windows. A building abandoned for decades. Outside sat 6 vehicles. I counted carefully. 6. A modern SUV. An old Forest Service pickup. A faded station wagon. A Jeep from the 70s. A dented sedan. And the green truck from the parking lot. Snow covered them equally. As though they had all arrived the same morning. The front door of the station stood open. Inside, dust coated everything except a narrow path leading toward a back office. Against every survival instinct I possessed, I followed it. The office contained only a wooden desk, a lantern, and 13 leather-bound journals. 12 old. 1 new. My stomach tightened. The newest notebook lay open. The handwriting matched Field Observer 13. Except the final page had changed. Someone had added another sentence. The next observer has arrived. Beneath it, fresh ink. Still wet. I leaned closer. The handwriting looked painfully familiar. Not similar. Mine. I stumbled backwards so quickly the chair overturned. No. I hadn't written it. I knew I hadn't. I grabbed the notebook. The remaining pages fluttered rapidly in an invisible current. Not randomly. Stopping on different entries as those searching. Then they settled near the middle. Another paragraph had appeared. He always believes he chose to come. He always thinks he discovered the journals first. That belief protects him until he reaches the station. I slammed the notebook shut. Outside. Footsteps crossed the porch. Slow. Measured. Not threatening. Patient. I held my breath. Another step. Then another. A shadow passed the cracked window. Someone, or something, stood outside. But whoever it was never entered. Instead, a quiet voice spoke through the open doorway. Calm. Almost sympathetic. You don't have to hide. It sounded like me. Not identical. Older. More tired. I didn't answer. You already know why you're here. Silence. Then. You've been reading our memories. Our. Not my. Our. The footsteps moved away from the porch. Against all reason. I followed. Outside, the clearing had changed. Fog drifted low across the snow. Standing among the trees were figures. Not ghosts. Not monsters. People. Men and women wearing weathered field jackets from different decades. Some carried clipboards. Others old surveying equipment. None moved. None looked directly at me. There were 12 of them. Then one more stepped from behind a spruce. He wore modern hiking clothes. My backpack. My boots. My face. He looked exhausted. Older by perhaps 20 years. There was no malice in his expression. Only sorrow. I tried to leave too, he said quietly. My throat felt dry. What are you? He smiled faintly. The wrong question. He looked toward the valley beyond the ranger station. The valley doesn't trap bodies. He tapped his temple. It traps certainty. I couldn't speak. He continued. Every person who enters carries one complete version of themselves. His voice remained steady. The valley doesn't erase memories. It distributes them. Pieces. Fragments. Emotions. Instincts. Recognition. Across everyone who comes afterward. The journals aren't records. They're anchors. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I don't understand. I know. He nodded. I didn't either. He glanced toward the silent figures between the trees. They're not prisoners. They're what remains when someone can no longer tell which memories are theirs. The words struck harder than any scream could have. Because they weren't describing death. They were describing identity. The oldest fear humanity possesses. Not dying. Becoming someone you no longer recognize. Snow drifted gently through the clearing. No one moved. The older version of me stepped closer. When you leave, you'll remember enough to survive. But never enough to explain. And every few years, someone finds the journals again. I stared at him. Then how does this end? He looked toward the mountains. It doesn't. It rests. The wind shifted. For the first time since entering the valley, I smelled pine. Real pine. Fresh. Alive. The older man smiled. That means you've chosen. I didn't choose anything. You chose to stop looking for certainty. The forest dissolved. Not dramatically. Not like a dream. More like mist lifting from a landscape after sunrise. The ranger station faded. The vehicles disappeared. The silent observers became ordinary trees. Then, darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was lying beside a well-marked hiking trail. Search and rescue volunteers surrounded me. One knelt beside my shoulder. Easy. You've been missing overnight. Overnight. I remembered entering the trail shortly before sunset. Nothing more. At least, nothing I could prove. Doctors blamed dehydration and exposure. Friends blamed stress. I accepted both explanations. Eventually I returned to work. For a while. Then I resigned. Not because I feared the wilderness. Because I had begun treating every forgotten archive box like a door. Months later, while packing my office, Sarah handed me a sealed envelope she'd found behind a filing cabinet. No return address, she said. Probably yours. Inside rested a single pine needle. Still green. Still carrying the scent of fresh mountain sap. Alongside it was a folded photograph. 4 researchers smiling beside a trail sign. Only this time. I counted 5 people. I looked again. 4. Again. 5. No matter how carefully I counted, certainty slipped away before I reached the end. I finally placed the photograph back into the envelope without trying again. Some questions survive precisely because they cannot be answered honestly. Years have passed since then. I've hiked many forests. Crossed countless mountain trails. Watched fog roll through valleys that held nothing more mysterious than stone, water, and trees. Most wilderness still comforts me. Most silence still feels peaceful. But every now and then, usually just before dawn, I wake with the unmistakable certainty that I've forgotten someone important. Not a name. Not a face. A version of myself. Someone who walked beside me through a valley I can no longer find on any map. Sometimes I wonder whether that feeling is simply the ordinary grief of growing older, the realization that every decision leaves behind lives we never lived. Sometimes I wonder whether the journals were only stories written by lonely researchers whose isolation blurred memory into myth. Both explanations are comforting. Neither fully satisfies me. Because I still own that pine needle. I sealed it inside a glass vial years ago. It has never dried. Every spring, when snow begins melting in the Colorado high country, its scent grows stronger for a few days before fading again. I've never shown it to anyone. Not because I believe it proves anything. Objects rarely prove the stories we attach to them. They only remind us of the questions we failed to answer. And perhaps that's the quietest horror hidden inside every wilderness worth respecting. Not that something waits beyond the next ridge. Not that ancient secrets survive beneath forgotten trees. But that somewhere, beyond the edge of certainty, there may exist places where the landscape does nothing more supernatural than reveal how fragile our identities really are. The darkness inside a forest is rarely the greatest danger. The greater danger is discovering that, when every landmark disappears, the first thing we struggle to recognize is ourselves. VidIQ